Good morning, everyone. And thank you for coming to listen to us as we talk a little bit about open source and how it's being introduced into the enterprise. So as you know, open source is becoming more and more popular, more and more relevant and important, even in large enterprises. And today I have with me some distinguished panelists who have brought inner source into their own companies, and they're here to tell you real-life stories of how they did it. So my name is Bonnie, and I'm the head of professional services here at GitHub. And with me today, I have Chad Arimura, who's the VP of Serverless at Oracle. Chad, would you like to say a few things about yourself and what open source means to you?
Sure, thanks Bonnie. So my name's Chad Arimura. I'm currently VP of Serverless at Oracle Corporation. I joined Oracle about 1.5 years ago by way of a startup acquisition. My former company, I was the CEO and co-founder of a company called Iron.io, where we were pretty early in the serverless space, started that back in 2011. My open source journey started early on in my career, almost 20 years ago with the LAMP stack. If you think about the LAMP stack, you got Linux, Apache, MySQL, Perl, PHP. At the time, for me, it was Perl. And if you just think about that acronym, it's all open source. And open source has been a big part of my journey all along. But I didn't actually start contributing a lot until 2013 when Solomon Hykes launched Docker at the GoSF meetup a few days after PyCon. And when my co-founder and I both looked at it, we saw it as a replacement for LXC, and we both had this aha moment where there was this amazing technology emergence coming with containers. And so within 18 months after that, we released an open source project called Iron Functions. Iron Functions is now forked, called the FN project at Oracle, and it's open source serverless computing. So we're the creators and stewards of that, and we eventually like to see it inside of a foundation like CNCF. So open source is really important to everything that we work on.
Thank you, Chad.
Yeah.
I'll move on to you, Shilla. This is Shilla Saebi. She's the OSS community lead at Comcast. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started in open source?
Sure. I currently work as an open source program manager with a focus on community in the open source programs office at Comcast. I've been with the company for a long time, about 8 years, and my journey started as a Microsoft Exchange operations engineer. And it would be interesting to find out how did I even get into open source. So there was an opening as we were building our private cloud team, and I applied, and it was OpenStack. And so my journey with open source started as an OpenStack operations engineer, and I was lucky to get to go to a conference in Hong Kong about 3 months into my job, into my role, and this is about 5 years ago. And when we went to the conference, our VP came back and said, I'd love to see you and the rest of the team contributing back to the software. And so I sat down one weekend and taught myself Git, and I learned, and I started doing upstream contributions to OpenStack. I fell in love with the open source community. I fell in love with the fact that I was working worldwide, globally with folks, and that's how my journey started.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. We'll move on to you, Per Ploug. He is the community manager for open source at Zalando.
Yep. So I'm part of the open source team at Zalando. We are a small consulting team that works across the organization. So we work both in engineering teams and also with legal and compliance. So we try to create like a cross-organizational alignment on what open source actually is and how we work with it. So I got involved in open source 12, 13 years ago. Just out of school, there was no job, so me and a friend of mine, we made this digital agency and we started building websites. Mm-hmm. And through that, we got exposed to this open source, a Danish open source project actually called Umbraco, which is a CMS, a content management system. And we adopted that, we started using it, but very quickly I became much more engaged in actually contributing to the content management system than actually contributing to any of our clients' projects. So I soon realized that agency life was not really for me, based on that. So one thing led to another, and I joined that company or that project and the backing company as a partner and first employee. And then I spent 10 years in that project trying to figure out how do you have an open source project and how do you have like a business that's actually sustainable. So we ran the business just completely bootstrapped, not taking any money, and then figuring out how do we find a model that works with you have a business that needs to make money, you have a project that needs to thrive, you have a community that has certain needs, and you also have paying customers. So how do you combine those 4 factors into something that works for you? So.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing. So as we have this conversation today, we're going to talk a little bit about the tangible pieces of how you bring open source into your organization. So to do so, let's start a little bit about driving adoption first. It's important to build a community for open source to be successful inside the enterprise. So I'll start with you, Per, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what are some of the challenges that Zalando faced as you were trying to drive adoption and interest in open source?
Yeah. So Zalando is enterprise size, but it doesn't have the enterprise mindset. It still feels like a startup, and it started 10 years ago, and our very first store where we sold shoes was based on Magento. And today we use very different technology. We use Kubernetes and Postgres and to scale our business. So we've always had like a natural choice for open source. Mm-hmm. It is the natural part of our stack. So we've never actually had to convince anyone that open source is a good idea. So we're very, very fortunate for that. But what we have had to do is create alignment and also figure out where do we prioritize our resources in regards to our engagement to open source. And we do this in different ways. So first of all, when we onboard new developers in the organization, we expose them to the idea of open source. We expose them to the challenges in regards to copyright and licensing. We expose them to how do you even work with open source? How is the collaborative way of pull requests and giving feedback and so. So that both applies to inner source and open source. And the last thing we also do is we're very focused on creating processes, documentation, and tools that's transparent and open to everyone to see. How do we actually release a project? How do we decide that it's a good idea to open source something? So for us, it's not so much about adoption, it's more adopting the mindset of where does open source create the most value to us, because if we just release all the code as open source, we would not have time to maintain it anyway. So.
Very good point. Maintenance is important, and we'll come back to a little bit more around the maintenance and governance in a bit. But let's come to you, Chad. What are some ways that you've seen that are successful in not only driving adoption, but increasing awareness?
So Oracle is an interesting company. It is one of the foundational companies in software. It's been around for, I think, almost 50 years. And it's a really big company. I mean, we're talking 150,000 employees, 50,000 engineers, 60,000 engineers. I could be off by some amount, but it's really large. And so it's not a build it and they will come mentality of open source. So what we found at Oracle is that there is this very interesting passion for open source, but it's harder to expose that. And so we found an opportunity to announce the open source of FN project at Java 1 last year. In fact, we had sponsorship all the way up to the top. There was probably 5,000 people in the audience, 50,000 people through the live stream. And we added a little bit of theatrics to it where on stage, I pressed the danger zone, like you're in the danger zone, and I pressed the GitHub make it open source. And it had a really big impact. And from that moment on, almost weekly, I have engineers from inside of Oracle reaching out to me and saying, how can we get involved? How can we participate in the project? And that's something that it really helped put us on the map by doing something like that, and it was an opportunity to help kind of spread awareness. So grassroots is great, but it takes a little bit of momentum or theatrics to kind of get things kicked off.
I like your point about theatrics. At GitHub, when we do a project, as of course all of you know, the way we do it is merging it. And so one of the things we do is when we have a big project that's going live, sometimes some of us will gather over Zoom and we press the green button with some ceremony to say, okay, this is now merged and this project's now live. It's very fun to do, and it gets excitement.
Well, the funny part of that is when I did it on stage, we had it all planned, but then I got a 2FA warning, my two-factor. But luckily, my phone was in my pocket, and I had one password, and so it went pretty quickly, but I was like sweating.
Live demos.
Yeah.
Dangers of live demos. All right, so let's talk a little bit about processes now. Now that we've gotten awareness and adoption going, it's important to build some processes that enhance and nurture open source in your organizations. So let me come to you, Shilla, first. And tell me a little bit more, or tell us, our audience here, how does the employee at Comcast, how do they contribute and how does that work?
Sure, so currently our developers, engineers, what they do is they submit a ticket to us, And my colleague, she handles most of the contribution requests that come in. We call them open source contribution requests. These come in and we have a queue that's monitored by our team, and also we have an open source advisory council. This consists of folks from the networking team, from the security team, we have well-respected engineers across the company, as well as legal, and representation from our team as well. And we try to have this board, it helps us to reduce friction between legal side and as well as our engineers. And so our team, what my colleague does is she has prep calls if it's an open source contribution that's large, if it's a large feature, but if it's something that's a bug fix, or if it's a documentation, or if it's a repeat contribution to a certain project, we do have blanket approvals that get approved online, so they're not as tedious. We also have, recently, which we were really excited about, we had an employee satisfaction award that our team won because people are generally happy. I think developers like to be able to contribute to open source seamlessly, and we're trying to do that. And it's a work in progress. We're continuing to try to automate this process as much as we can, but we've seen that big improvements in the past year.
Yeah, and we see that, with all the customers we get a chance to speak with, having just the right amount of process is difficult, but very important. We can process something to death and then it's not exciting or interesting anymore, but if there's no structure and no process at all, then it becomes really difficult to grow also. So Per, I know that you have a very interesting life cycle for open source projects at Zalando.
Yeah, at least we try to think about the life cycle in that way. So a bit of context, we have 2,000 developers and we have roughly 220 open source projects. So it's a large amount of things to actually manage. Our philosophy is that we want to take ownership for the things we release. Code without ownership and without maintainers have very little value to anyone. It's very hard to adopt any sort of open source code that doesn't have ownership or maintainers. It's a large risk rather than an opportunity. So we divide this into three phases, basically. So we have an incubation phase, where we have very clearly defined requirements for how can you even open source something. There's of course compliance-related rules, but there's also just having the conversation about, does this actually bring value to Zalando to open source? Does this even make sense to us? Is this something we can see a value in taking ownership of long term? The second is, does this bring value to anyone outside of Zalando? We might release something that's very specific to our infrastructure and it doesn't make sense for anyone else to be exposed to that. And then finally, we also need to ensure that we have maintainers that wish to actually be part of this project long term and take ownership of it. So that's the incubation phase, and that typically runs over a 6-month period where the maintainers have the responsibility to grow and mature this project. We then review this. We have an internal review group that consists of current maintainers and the open source team. And then we decide if this can now be promoted into a stable project, maybe it needs to be in incubation a bit longer, or maybe we decide to actually pull it back into our GitHub Enterprise because this was clearly something that didn't work out. And then you have the last phase, which is the most difficult one, which is retirement or decline of the project itself. So what do you decide to do with projects that don't have any maintainers or haven't been maintained for years, and you still get pull requests for this? How do you handle this? So depending on what kind of legal and copyright options you have as a company, you have to decide if you want to find new internal maintainers of this, if you want to just announce it as abandoned, or maybe you can find the previous maintainers or previous employees that might want to fork this project and continue working on it. So this is where we have to think about just beyond releasing things, but actually think about what will happen with this in 2 or 3 years, because things change so quickly that this might not be a thing that's relevant in a couple of years, and what do you do with it then? So.
Interesting. When you were talking about the incubation part, there's a question in my mind. How does a project even get incubated? Is it a grassroots effort where the developers band together and say, I need to solve this problem, and therefore I'm going to build this solution to it, or how does it work? Yeah,
so typically it's projects that's already been built inside of Zalando that solves one of our internal projects or problems, and we then want to share that code with the world. Typically we have a form where people simply just tell us that they want to open source this. This form is designed in a way that people think about the responsibilities that they have, so they have to list themselves and other people who are interested in maintaining and stuff like that. So that's the initial step, and then after that we have discussions with the maintainers and the review group about, is this a good idea or not? So it all starts with a conversation, really. It's not, we don't try to be bad cops and say no to everything, that's not the point of it, but it is that we need to see that there's actually a motivation to do this.
And motivations, of course, very important to keep a project going, and then the maintenance piece of it becomes very important as well. So let's talk a little bit about the processes for maintaining and contributing to these projects. This is a GitHub event, and you've heard some of the things we're doing at our keynotes yesterday and today. What are some of the ways, I'd like to know if you've had any experience with, what are some of the ways that GitHub contributes to the workflow that you have in your workplaces for open source? So let me start with you, Chad, and if you don't mind sharing with us how this works at Oracle.
Yeah, so specifically for the FN project, we have a pretty standard GitHub workflow for PR requests. The community will contribute some PR. We need 1+1 from a core member of the team, and then that can get promoted and ready for merging with the master branch. However, we have a pretty arcane CLA process, which is a contributor license agreement process. Older company, older processes, which we are trying to reform, but you still need to take a sheet of paper, and until recently you literally had to fax it somewhere, but you have to take a picture and email it in, somebody manually puts it on the site, and you get listed with like 3,000 other contributors. So we built a scraper that would scrape that site, read for your GitHub username, and then clear the CLA check from red to green. And we did that with a background process, and we're actually talking about potentially moving that to a GitHub action. So, a little plug for your new
for our new work as of yesterday, our new announcements. Well, thank you. I hope you find a lot of value in GitHub Actions. It's meant to make the developer's life easier, which is essentially our goal.
Yeah, but I need pre-approval to use it. I'm still on the beta list, so. You heard it here first.
We might be able to help you with that. All right, so let me go to you, Per.
Yep.
How does this work at Zalando?
So specifically for the open source projects that we use internally, we expose them on the public GitHub, and that's also where our teams work. So we work in the open, we're transparent about what we do and the changes that comes in from the community, but we then also mirror them inside of our organization in GitHub Enterprise. So we pull the changes in, and then we run all our internal compliance checks and all the things we need to do to ensure that this is something we can actually deploy in production. So the obvious advantage for this is that we have the same experience and the same set of tooling on each side, so our developers can do what they are used to inside of the company as outside of the company. So that combination of having an internal set of repositories where we do that more complicated deployment process combined with the exposure and the transparency of having the public open source projects out on github.com is a very good combination for us. And again, as Chad said, actions, so when is that coming for the enterprise?
Good question. We are thinking about it. It's very much on our mind, and it's going to make its way to our roadmap as well. And we'll make sure that you're the first to know when we have some defined timelines around that. But we know that our enterprise customers really desire to use this as well. But if you do want to use it right now, it is available on github.com, and so especially for Zalando, you have an option to try it out, play with it a little bit already. So there are a couple other things I wanted to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about let's talk about maybe one challenge each of you might have faced or the company might have faced in introducing open source or growing open source. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll go into talking a little bit about maybe a success metric or two that you use to measure successes. So let's start with you, Chad. Could you tell us about maybe a challenge that, in particular with Oracle open source, they don't always sound like they might gel very well. So tell us maybe about a challenge, and then perhaps one success metric that you'd use.
Yeah, I mean, I think some companies culturally are just structured for open source, specifically, more modern cloud-native companies. I shouldn't say modern, but born in the cloud companies typically have more open source kind of flexibility culturally, internally. With Oracle, I mean, it's such a big company that it's hard to spread the word. You need sort of channels to do that. And for us, one of the challenges has been once getting people involved, allowing them to get integrated with the project, so really spreading the word on different projects internally. And so the way that we've been able to overcome that is, like you said earlier, executive sponsorship, A big part of it has been driving adoption through the Java 1 announcement, but also Shilla mentioned earlier, reducing friction is a big thing. So one thing that we were able to do was become sponsors of the CNCF and Linux Foundation, and so with that came a sort of a blanket agreement that anybody inside of Oracle can contribute to Linux Foundation projects without going through a lot of hoops. And that was a really, really big move for Oracle to be able to do that, because otherwise it's pretty difficult, and rather than contributing during work hours, you just say, you know what, I'm not going to do it. And so now that kind of reduces that friction to contribution.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me go over to you, Shilla. So similar questions, maybe a challenge that you might have faced or the company, and then maybe a success metric or two.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll talk about a little bit about inner source for this one.
Sure.
We have come through in situations where it's been challenging to let folks know that it's okay to work on other teams' projects and to figure out what the culture is around that. And so we actually have an inner source pilot program that we have been running for the past year.
Okay.
And this is kind of how we overcame the challenge. We created an org in our GitHub Enterprise, and we ended up putting the project there. And then we started marketing it and telling folks, hey, it's okay to contribute to this. We did a blog post, we posted in Slack channels, we had the team do a presentation at some of our internal events, and we found that once we started spreading the word, we started finding more contributors coming. So I think one of the challenges was that people didn't actually know that it was okay to do that. I remember when I was in operations, I would log into GitHub Enterprise, but I didn't really go into other repos or even dare look into them because I didn't know, what that team was working on. But now we're trying to incorporate a culture where that's okay, so with this pilot program. So we're picking projects as we go along. We've done 2 so far, and it's been really working great.
Yeah, I had a chance to speak with some of our customers at an event on Monday, and one of the things that we heard frequently was the importance of raising awareness and the importance of celebrating small successes early. So, the presentations by the team, the announcements on Slack, on newsletters, it just helps that groundswell that you kind of need, that immense amount of interest and excitement from folks who may be a little bit intimidated to start something new, to see that others are being successful and being celebrated for that success is something that's on many people's minds. Great. Let me move over to you, Per.
Yeah. So Zalando has been doing open source for quite some time now, so we see this as kind of in our 3rd iteration. That also means there's a lot of history in how people perceive open source inside Zalando. In the beginning, the first wave of open source was very much just release everything, which is fine. The enthusiasm is good, getting started. And that slowly progressed into an idea of we need standards. We need some common ground on what can actually be open sourced. And then we progressed further into thinking about the life cycle now. But having that process also means that we have many, many different definitions of what is actually a standard of this. So creating clarity about how you do open source and why you do open source at Zalando was a challenge we faced. So just aligning all that and addressing all that history and making one clear place that this is just the thing we're doing. This was all when we released opensource.zalando.com earlier this year, which is an MIT licensed, pretty much all our guidelines and documentation how to do this. So we have one single place to actually just tell all our developers and everyone else actually also how we do these kinds of things and why. For metrics, we generally divide them into 3 different groups.
Okay.
We measure many different things, but generally we are very interested to see if we are capable of attracting community contributions to open source projects. So we count them and we also divide them into see who are the return contributors. Are people coming back again? Are we able to attract new ones as well? And then we divide that into looking at each individual projects and see how they do that. Secondly, we look at how do we actually address those contributions. So we look at the lifespan of a pull request. Is it actually merged? Does it get feedback? Do we actually respond to the contributions that we get from the community? And then the third area is, do we contribute upstream? So we monitor all our GitHub member profiles, and we look at what kind of projects do they actually contribute to.
Okay.
So inside of Zalando, we have a tool called Tech Radar. There's also a public version called Zalando Tech Radar, so you can Google that, which is advisory on what kind of projects you should use in your daily work. So it's strictly advisory, but we announce to developers what kind of projects we would recommend they start using. So we monitor these and see, are our developers actually engaged in these projects? Do they have an insight in the stack that we actually depend on? And it's a good indicator for us that our developers actually dive into these projects and understands them as well. So that's the third thing we measure. On a bit more like soft metric is that in Europe, Zalando is perceived as a fashion and retail company. We sell shoes online, so we're not really generally perceived as a tech company. But we have a very large tech department, and we have a lot of technology that actually enables us to scale this very big store. So open source is one of those things that gives us value that we can actually show the outside world of how the engine room works in such an organization. We can actually talk about how we use Kubernetes and how we scale our organization, how we handle Black Friday and sell many, many shoes on that single day. That requires an enormous amount of technology. And if we didn't have open source as a channel for that, then we don't really know how to tell that story. So that's important to us as well, to be perceived as a tech company, which we are, and also attract, well, new hires as well.
Right. And retention and attraction of talent is something on everyone's mind, and we know that making our workplace more attractive to the talent we're trying to hire is important, and allowing them to participate in open source, having inner source culture are all things that make employers that much more attractive to the folks we're trying to hire. So let's talk a little bit about, let's go into a lightning round. Let me see if I can get our slide. All right. So before we came here, I asked these wonderful panelists a couple of questions that I thought would make for an interesting end to our conversation. So one of the things we wanted to do was help you learn something new. So we're going to talk about an interesting statistic that each of them have brought, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that's interesting and what's the story behind them. And then I asked each of these folks, what's the one thing they'd want you to take away from this conversation? So we'll go into that as well. So let's start with you, Per. What is your favorite statistic on open source?
So this is the number of bugs in Zalando open source software. No. This is, I think, so this is a bit of a cheeky thing, but this is the amount of dollars you would have to pay to get access to sophisticated software for machine learning or for managing containers or any other sort of thing you would normally perceive as very expensive specialized software. The state of the art in many of these areas of software today is free and open source. So a startup in Africa or a high school student in Sweden can just take these components and build something that would normally be out of range. So I think that's interesting to all of us. The enterprise have had the advantage of having that exclusive access to very expensive software, and that's not the case anymore. And we need to be very much aware that that advantage is gone, and we cannot ignore open source anymore. So.
Thank you for that. Let's go to you, Shilla.
Sure.
What's your favorite statistic?
So 80%, I learned about this yesterday during the State of the Octoverse session. 80% of the contributors that are contributing to open source software through GitHub are from outside of the US. And I think that's truly fascinating. I mean, it's development that's going on, that's changing the world, that's happening internationally, worldwide, on a global level. To me, that was really mind-blowing. So.
I think it was a surprising statistic for us too, as in, not surprising as much as eye-opening. There are so many people outside of our little country here who care as much about software development and who are transforming their businesses in the same way as we see some of our customers here do. And it's really nice to see that you're not alone. Wherever you are, whenever you're coding, there is somebody else on GitHub, somewhere else in the world, probably trying to do the same thing as you're doing, and if you're open sourced, then you can help each other.
Yep, I love it.
All right, let's move over to you, Chad.
So I read this in the State of Devops report 2018. I think Puppet Labs and a couple of companies put it out. And their metric was exceptional or top-rated developers are 75% or 1.75x more likely to be using open source than the average developer. And they are also 1.5x more willing to share and expand the usage of open source internally. So I don't know how they defined exceptional developers, but I thought it was a really interesting metric to really show that you can't ignore the proliferation of open source in the enterprise, and it's kind of inevitable at this point.
So if we find an exceptional developer and get them to contribute to open source, then we should get a return that's 1.75 times 1.5?
I think so.
You think so? All right. So those are just some of the statistics. If you have a chance to look at the State of the Octoverse, it does talk a lot about where is GitHub, what is happening in that world, what are people working on, what are people working with. And so if you have a chance to check it out, please do. But in the meantime, here's one thought our panelists would like to leave you with today. So I will start with you again, Per.
Yeah, so I think when many people hear the word governance, they see it as a very negative thing, or at least the whole part of getting a no to what you want to do. I see governance as an enabler and actually be clear about what you want to do. So to me, to enable participation in the enterprise, you need to clearly communicate what is actually allowed to do. What are the rules of play here? Mm-hmm. What can you and can you not do? What are the goals of doing open source inside of your organization? Be clear about that. Be upfront about it, rather than hiding it away or not having any opinion about it. So when you start with your open source journey in the enterprise, might as well start with that. Have a clear strategy, have a clear governance model for how you want to do this. Because you'd rather have that you're proactive about it and just be upfront, and so it doesn't happen by accident. That's a much better way of going about it. It creates clarity for people participating, and with clarity you also have a higher degree of participation because people know what they can actually be a part of.
Yeah, and I think governance is one of those very important topics where without proper governance, an open source strategy can't truly thrive. You know, you need those guardrails, you need that help and the support of your leadership team. And it reminds me of something that you had said earlier, Shilla. Did you want to talk a little bit about how the leadership team at Comcast supports open source, and then we'll come back to you for your last thought.
Sure, absolutely. So we're very lucky. The head of our open source program office, she sits on the board of the Linux Foundation, Nithya Ruff, and our chief software architect at Comcast recently came up. It's just an example of how much support we do have. He presented us with the idea of an open source fellowship pilot that we should run, and so our team ran with it. And he's been in full support of it. We have 30 engineers across Comcast that are dedicating 1 day a week, 20% of their time towards upstream contributions. And it's various projects, it's not just one. And so there's little sub-teams that are working together, and it's a 1-year-long program. We also have an open source conference that's happening next month in Philadelphia. That's not just for Comcast folks, it's also for public as well. And we have outside speakers, and we're super excited because it's the first iteration, but we have the president of technology from Comcast coming to keynote. I mean, that says a lot for our open source awards. We had C-level executive handing out the awards. He came, out of his busy day and helped us out there. So we really appreciate it, and I think it's really important to have.
I agree. So let's talk about your last thought.
Sure.
What you'd like to leave this audience with.
Absolutely. So one of the goals that I usually, that I set for myself with my role at work, with my career, and even in my personal life, is to be more transparent and open in my communication and everything that I do. And so what I would encourage you all to do is, if you know of a person or a team or a colleague that you don't really know what they work on, or you sit near them, you see them all the time, but you have no idea what they're doing, I would encourage you to start talking to them and ask them questions and get to know each other and find out if there are ways where you can collaborate with them and work together. That way you're not reinventing the wheel, but also you're getting to know other teams and people.
Communication and collaboration happen to be foundations on which GitHub is built on, but in any facet of life, it ends up being one of those very important and key things to do. And I'm going to move over to you, Chad.
Open source is happening whether you like it or not. I'm actually still surprised at how many tech executives I meet who say that open source is not a part of their technical strategy internally, and that they don't adopt it, or they won't use it, or it's too scary, or the investment's too high, or it's not free, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we walk 6 rooms down and we meet with the developers, and the developers are like, actually, we're using this, 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 and this. So it's kind of like, it's kind of happening. It's like trying to stop water as it's moving, rolling downhill or streaming downhill. So it's happening whether you like it or not. And I think what we're trying to do at Oracle is this cultural shift around open source. And it's been a really fun thing to watch internally how that's kind of flourished. And so Oracle's now embracing that more and more as we've gone along over the past couple of years. It's really exciting to see.
Well, thank you. As I think we established today, open source is not impossible to attain. It is possible to do at very different companies. Given that every company is a software company, open source becomes an essential part of every company's strategy. And hopefully, you'll leave this session with a couple of ideas of what you can bring back to your companies, to your teams, that'll hopefully make your development lives a little bit easier. So thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. We're going to be ending now, but we'll be around for a couple more minutes if you wanted to come up and ask some questions to our distinguished panelists. Thank you, Per. Thank you, Shilla. Thank you, Chad. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.